What's going on, folks? Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and I finally wanted to get back to a series of polls that I conducted over on my YouTube community page, which was your user rated class complexity levels. Now, Wizards of the Coast, in the beginning of Chapter 2 of the Player's Handbook for 2024, has a table that lists out what the various classes, like their primary ability score, what they like and their complexity. And that complexity obviously is only on a scale of 1 to 3, basically low, average, or high. And they list that complexity for every class contained within the player's handbook. Now, I knew this was going to probably cause a little bit of back and forth in the community as to what constitutes, what should be low ranking, what should be high ranking. So I conducted a series of polls here on my YouTube channel to get an opinion and a kind of a barometer from all of you, at least those of you that chose to respond to the poll, which I will say on average looked to be around 3,000 or so people engaged with every single poll. It may be a little bit more on some, a little bit less on others, but that's my general consensus. It looks around 3,000 or so people. So to give you a barometer out of all the people that watch this channel, what kind of everyone's thought process was. And I would say, interestingly enough, for the most part, you all agree with Watsy's uh, their idea of what stands for complex, but there are a couple of differences. And some of them, the difference between something like average or high was pretty close in the grand scheme of things. So I thought we would go ahead and I made up a table showing what every vote was for each low, average, and high, and then again put Watsy's their level of choice on the side to kind of give it a comparison. So I thought we could go ahead and dive into that now. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, though, please consider doing so. It is it's basically one click for you. It means a lot for me. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. So here you can see the table. Again, the orange highlights are the ones that won, and the green highlights are the ones where what the community chose matches what Watsy chose. So first up, we have the Barbarian. I thought it was an interesting choice that Watsy said the complexity level of the Barbarian class was average. I would argue that a barbarian should be low complexity. They're not that difficult. Raging isn't super a lot to manage, in my opinion, but either way. And much to my agreement, you all came out in an overwhelming favor to say that the barbarian, at least 72% of you anyway, said you agree the barbarian should be low complexity. With only just 1% in high. Now, for the Bard, Watsy called the Bard high complexity, which I could definitely understand with the concept of the way that the different bardic inspirations can interact and have different abilities there, the kind of magical secrets and the magical discoveries, their ability to pick from other classes spell lists, could warrant them a high ranking for complexity. And while you can see it was only 11% difference between average and high, you all majority agreed that the bard should be average complexity, not high. Now, when we get to the cleric here, for instance, you voted in pretty much overwhelming favor that the cleric should be average complexity. I also find this one interesting as well because, again, I would consider most casters to be more on the average to high side just because of the management of spell slots. Now, the thing is, we don't know 100% the parameters that Watsy was using when they went ahead and made that complexity list. My assumption is that complexity list is geared towards new players. If you are a new player who's never played before and are looking to dive into Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition with the 2024 books, this has something to kind of give you a gauge of when you sit down and go to decide which character to play. Oh, maybe I want to play one that's low, average, or, do I want to try a high complexity class? But I would say that anything with a lot of spell slots would more or less fall onto the high side, in my opinion. But either way, you and Watsy agree that you believe the cleric is of average complexity. When we get to the druid, you and Watsy are also in unison here, saying that you think the druid is high complexity. My guess is this is based around wild shaping because in a lot of ways I would argue that the cleric and the druid are pretty similar in the way a lot of their subclass abilities work and their overall general main class abilities. However, I guess the concept of tracking temporary hit points and turning into different animals and tracking those forms could be considered tough, more difficult to manage, which I guess is why both you and Watsy came out in overwhelming favor of high complexity for the druid. Probably surprising no one is the fighter came in at low complexity on the fan user based poll as well as on Watsy's end. I am a little bit surprised to see 30% of people put the fighter at average. Now I realize subclasses can make a lot of difference here, and we didn't really do any specific diving into whether or not the how the subclass comes into play in this situation. But I still think, regardless, fighter is low complexity. That makes sense to me. Now they had put Watsy had put Monk at high complexity, and especially given the changes to Monk in the 2024 books with all the extra attacks and the different abilities and synergies and things they have, I could definitely understand that concept of high complexity. Another thing to consider is that when these polls came out, potentially not a lot of folks had access to the 2024 books. So I am curious, and sound off in the comments if you voted in this poll and your opinion would change having now read the 2024 books if you have access to it. Did that sway your opinion? And maybe after the books are out for a little while and time has gone by, maybe a month or two, maybe towards the end of the year before the Dungeon Master Guide comes out, we'll re-release this poll series to see if people's opinions have changed after people have had an opportunity to play with the newer versions of this class, to see maybe your opinion shifted one way or another on this. All right. Paladin and Ranger again landed smack in the middle on average, the exact same percentage on the average roll, which matches what Watsy said, and a very similar amounts on the low and high percent, so nothing too crazy there. Rogue landed again in the low percentage as Watsy had, with only 51%. I agree, rogues might have a little bit of nuance in their subclasses, but for the most part, it's sneak and stab, so I get that. Sorcerer, they had listed at high complexity. You all chose that as well, although 30% of you did lean towards the average on the Sorcerer. And then Warlock, also Wizards of the Coast had put down as high, and you also voted for that, though the percentages are much closer to average on Warlock. I also feel like Warlock would land on average for me, but maybe this is again just the concept of being somebody who's played the game a bunch. Warlock being average, meaning that, like, yes, you might have spells and things to choose, but your spell slots are limited, although you do have the concept of Eldritch Invocations, which could, in theory, also make things, which I'm assuming is where a lot of the complexity comes in with managing the pacts that come from, Eldritch Invocations, and then your subclass interactions and things like that. So I guess I could see that. Now, Wizards of the Coast said that the wizard was average. I also think the wizard should be high, as many of you did, with a 70% vote in favor of high complexity, just because of the amount of spells. I also do, as I've mentioned before, still feel like the wizard got a little bit, cheated out of its overall usefulness here, because or updates rather, not usefulness, updates, because I do feel like the base version of the sorcerer and the base version of the warlock got a pretty significant bump to their usability and their what kind of abilities they have, whereas the wizard basically just kind of got a couple of little updates, and for the most part it's just like, we have the biggest spell list, and that's cool, and I do agree with that, but I feel like they could have maybe used like one little tweak, and that's why I really liked in the Unearthed Arcana that we got that original concept of them basically having the ability to create unique versions of spells with a certain, with create spell, and they got away from that, and that kind of bums me out a little bit. And then lastly, I threw on there Artificer, and in a surprise move, the highest rated of any particular group, period, with 73% of you coming in favor of the Artificer being high complexity. Again, we had a couple of 72%. The majority of you, and I think this may have been the one that had the most votes as well. This was closer to 4,000 people voted on this one. And yes, 73% of you said that you believe the Artificer falls in the high complexity area. And I would agree with that, just given the way they have their kind of infusions and managing, creating magic items, and all of these different aspects, it definitely makes more sense for me that the Artificer falls in the high complexity tier. Now, again, we obviously still don't have the Artificer officially in 2024 rules. I'm hoping for a pretty significant update to that class when the opportunity does present itself. Hopefully, we'll get this in the 2025 Faerunian, player's handbook. I doubt that's going to be the case because artificers aren't really native to the world of Faerun. But who knows? They might slip it in the book anyway. So there you go, folks. I just wanted to go over this because I know I said I was going to make a video on where things landed on the complexity side of things. So let me know. Do you agree with this? I mean, this is the community consensus is saying everything that's here, but yeah, like I said, I more or less agree with everything where I could maybe say that the warlock could go down to average complexity. I could see the monk going to high, and I kind of thought that the cleric should have been high complexity as well. But either way, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I'll see you all next time.